The Enigma of Mrs. Larson, by Elton Gar. Dr. Meckel couldn't bring himself to classify the strange infection that had appeared in his hospital as a disease. There were some negative effects like high fever and all the other things that happen when your body tried to fight off an infection, but those went away after a day or two. While the thickening of the skin could have been bad, the other effects were enough to make things that could otherwise be harmful seem like nothing. That was because, since the infection had spread across the hospital, there hadn't been a single death. That included 3 patients who had been on palliative care and 1 patient who had been taken off life support to allow her to die. He currently had that woman in an MRI, and what he had found was far more disturbing than he could have expected. According to the machine, the woman who had walked into the room and followed directions perfectly had almost no brain activity. He almost thought that she had died in the room, but she wasn't entirely brain dead. When he asked her to move her hands, the language center of her brain lit up, and then as she moved more lit up, but not enough to explain any of it. The most logical possibility was that the machine was in error, but it had been working all day, and it matched with the other tests they had done and the accident the woman had been in. She shouldn't have made it to the hospital alive, and some would argue that she hadn't, which is why they had pulled the plug. But outside of her brain, the woman showed the same signs of being healed as the other patients. They were only still in the hospital because no one knew why they weren't dying. His best guess was that whatever had healed them hadn't been able to fix her brain damage. That might be worse for her family than the death would have been. But it was hard to feel bad today, not with patients who had been near death walking around the halls with their families. Removing Mrs. Larson from the MRI was as easy as putting her in. She followed simple directions, then stopped and waited. He put her in the wheelchair once they were outside, and as he began to push her down the hallway, he fell into normal patterns and said,
"Is there anything I can do to make your stay with us more pleasant?"
He had been talking to her off and on for the last day, because that seemed the polite thing to do. She would follow directions, but hadn't responded in any other way. This time her mouth opened and closed twice, then a flat, emotionless voice said,
"We would prefer more substance and information on your culture."
Dr. Meckel stopped walking and looked at the woman. He had never seen her before the accident that left her brain dead, but it was difficult to imagine that was how anyone spoke. Still, he was a doctor and this was his patient, so he said,
"What type of food do you like?"
Anything healthy for this body is acceptable, but salt, iron, and calcium are always valuable.
Dr. Meckel left her with a large bowl of cottage cheese, 2 bananas, and several dozen packages of salt. It seemed like overkill to him, but the woman insisted. She also had the remote control that controlled both the TV and her call light, though she hadn't changed off the weather channel. With how strange she was acting, he worried for the others. So far, there had been no real personality changes that he could see, at least not beyond the changes from feeling better. But that didn't mean there wouldn't be any changes. The 3 patients and their families were all together in the quarantine area. That was as much because he wanted to keep their hope in check, as because he expected to keep the infection quarantined, since it had taken them most of a week to figure out that anything was strange. Seeing them just standing made Dr. Meckel feel better, but he had to investigate, so he approached Mr. Higgins' daughter. Once they were alone and sitting, Dr. Meckel said,
"I hate to ask this, but I need to know if your father has shown any personality changes."
The 40-year-old woman looked almost like a child for a moment, as fear and worry appeared and disappeared, and was replaced with a wide grin as she said,
"He's more like himself than he has been in years. He's funny again, and he doesn't get angry or frustrated as much."
"That is good to hear,"
Dr. Meckel said, though he wasn't certain that his voice matched the words. It was good, assuming it was just his Alzheimer's being cured rather than something changing his brain. The other families saw fewer dramatic changes, which made sense as neither of them had dementia or any major mental health problems beyond the stress of illnesses that were expected to kill them. As he turned to leave the last of the 3 families, one of Mrs. Zimmerman's granddaughters said,
"Is Granny going to die?"
Dr. Meckel considered telling her the truth, that he had no idea what was happening to her grandmother, but telling that to a 9-year-old girl differed from telling an adult. So he squatted down to look the girl in the eyes and said,
"The cancer is gone. Beyond that, all I know is that she seems healthy. So I think you should try to enjoy all the time you get and let me focus on the rest."
Something about telling other people to focus on the positive helped Dr. Meckel do the same. So he returned to Mrs. Larson. She was the only one of his patients who wasn't with family. And while they knew she was alive, they understood that the person they had loved was gone, and even if she recovered, it was unlikely she would even know who they were. She had finally changed the channel. He looked at the news logo in the corner and, without a word, changed the channel. He still wasn't sure what she knew, but if she was a blank slate, he didn't want to fill it in with cable news. The woman turned to him and said,
I believe that understanding what a culture fears is a valuable insight. Could you explain why someone dressing differently from gender norms is so scary?
I can't say I really understand that myself. But what is important now is that I figure out what is going on before the CDC gets here.
The woman sat in silence for almost a minute and then said,
The Center for Disease Control. Yes, we agree it would be best to avoid alerting your government, for now.
Dr. Meckel felt stupid, but he had to ask, so he said,
You act as if you are not Mrs. Larson. Who are you?
It is not as simple as that. We are in part Mrs. Larson. Though we could not save her mind entirely, we can access the information in her brain to communicate with you. The other part of us is called the Jofoerin.
And what are you?
The doctor asked.
We are a symbiotic bacterium. We have come to make contact and see if you will become partners with us.
And you infected people who were near death,
Dr. Meckel said.
We do not like to inhabit those who are unwilling, but communication without a host is impossible. So we chose those who would be most likely to agree. But if they do not agree, we will leave them.
So they will die if they don't agree.
You all die. But the things that were killing them have been cured. We would not return them to their previous condition if we could.
And what about Mrs. Larson?
We have done everything we can. Perhaps with more information we can repair the brain, but we can't return memories that were lost. It is why we speak through her.
You still haven't told me where you are from,
Dr. Meckel said.
Does your species have memories of its origin?
I meant more recently. You speak as if you are making first contact.
We have lived on other worlds and known other species, but our knowledge is limited by the host, so we know little of it.
I think I believe you. And that means we have a problem. My boss made the call to the CDC a few hours ago, and a team is flying in from Atlanta. If you tell them what you told me, you will be given over to the military or the CIA. And unless I am wrong, they'll assume this is an invasion and look for a way to kill you.
We believe that is likely too. We will not resist. It is your world, and while we would join you, doing so without your permission is the worst crime anyone can commit.
What if someone was willing to take you without them knowing?
Dr. Meckel asked.
We believe in personal autonomy. If someone wishes to partner with us, we would do so.
Then I think it's worth the risk. Are you able to leave Mrs. Larson and join me?
That is not how it is typically done. We would send a small contingent to join you without abandoning this host.
I think I can convince them to limit their testing. They'll still run basic tests on everyone, but keeping someone who is catatonic for testing will be easier. It would be best if there was nothing for them to find.
That is an acceptable plan. Simply take Mrs. Larson's hands and we will make the transfer.
Dr. Meckel stopped for a moment to consider. This was dangerous, and not just for him. He could be exposing the world. But it made sense. If they wanted to control people, why start with people who were dying? And if they wanted to invade in secret, why tell him? More importantly, he was a doctor, and they could save people he couldn't. With their help, he wouldn't have to helplessly watch people die. He took Mrs. Larson's hands and felt a warmth flow from her into him. It had been a strange week. Mrs. Larson had slipped back into full catatonia. She didn't even eat or drink on her own. But the other patients continued to improve in ways that defied modern medicine. Wrinkles disappeared, as did scars, and by the end of the week, they looked closer to 25 years old than their actual age, excluding their white hair and thicker skin. The CDC did more or less exactly what Dr. Meckel expected. They came in, took over, and ran every test they could think of. With each new test, Dr. Meckel became more convinced that they would find evidence of the Jofoerin, but nothing showed up on any test. The only strange thing was how perfect the blood tests were. Everything was exactly where it should be. With no evidence of anything except a miracle, the CDC couldn't do much. So they took the catatonic Mrs. Larson and left the others in quarantine. Meanwhile, Dr. Meckel could almost feel himself getting healthier. His knee didn't hurt anymore, and he slept better than he had in years. As he watched and waited for any signs of the Jofoerin controlling him, he saw no indications of them even communicating with him. All he felt was thickened skin and no longer needing his glasses. Until one day, he found himself in the emergency room and witnessed a man being brought in with a massive heart attack but still alive. Then he heard a distinct thought in the back of his head, separate from his own. It said, "We can help." And so he helped.
Author's note. I have spent a lot of time in hospitals recently. They are a wonder of the modern world. They are filled with people who have dedicated their lives to helping people, and nearly miraculous technology that lets them do that far better than anyone could have even a few decades ago. And yet for all that, they are often a sad place. Whether it is listening to people crying out in pain over and over, or seeing people who are a shell of who they once were, it is a tainted miracle. And I can only imagine what it must be like for the doctors, nurses, and aides who go in every day and try to do their best to help people through what is often the worst part of their life. This story gives a doctor a chance to do more. To have more than the half measure of healing we have now. Is it the right decision to trust an alien bacterium that says it is on your side? I'm not sure, but I think for someone who sees the pain and suffering every day, that taking the chance might be the only choice. If you enjoyed this story, you can get a free story every week by signing up for my newsletter at www.ansci-fi.com and following the link that says free book. Or you get access to all the stories including the patron exclusives by going to www.patreon.com/Elton and signing up at any support level. Thank you. Elton Gar.